A typical way was when he was out in the forest dressed as a priest. He stops two abbots and he asks of charity, which they should give. I mean, their order says they must give charity, and they say they have no money, they've been robbed. The supposition is, of course, that Robin Hood has robbed them. He doesn't like this, so he tells them they must get on their knees and pray to the Virgin Mary. After praying, they stand up again, and Robin insists they search each other. And they have, I think, it's a matter of £300. He gives them £50 between them and keeps 250 for himself. He tells them not to lie again, and never to lie with another man's wife, and to be good to virgins, which shows the type of man he was. Now, whether this was superstition, and he honestly believed that the Virgin Mary had sent the money in view of the church at the times, or whether it was a bit of jiggery-pokery, I couldn't guess.
So he was, in fact, a particularly devout, a particularly religious man.
Oh, a very devout man. He said 3 masses a day, one for the Father, one for the Holy Ghost, and one for the Virgin Mary. Yes, he was very devout.
Well, the Robin Hood of legend, of course, sort of lived a life of sort of idyllic passion in Sherwood Forest with Maid Marian. Now, does history bear this out?
Well, no. If you can look for somebody by the name of Marian in historical records, you've got nothing to go on at all. If it was Marian of Aceford, or we could bring it down to a district, then we might trace her in charters or something, but just Marian, this was possibly not a name at all. His nature was such that he didn't live any sort of illicit life with this girl. His whole nature would be against it.
See, he, in fact, I gather, sort of lived a rather chaste life as far as women were concerned. Now, what about this sort of personal feud that existed between Robin and the Sheriff of Nottingham? Was there anything to support this?
Well, the sheriff, he represented the institution. He represented the constitution sort of thing, and Robin Hood was against it. I mean, today you've got the students who are not really, they're not really socialist and anarchists, but they're opposed to the present government. They're opposed to the constitution, and I think that when it changes over to a Labour government, they'll still be against the constitution. It's one of those things.
But all this sort of evidence you've amassed, which proves that Robin Hood wasn't the Robin Hood of fact, wasn't the Robin Hood of legend. It's sort of exploding a rather basic sort of English myth. I mean, how did you sort of come to this conclusion? What did your research consist of?
In the first place, you must realise that my research, my work, does not go against a legend. In the last 300 years, mine is the only work which substantiates the legend and shows that Robin Hood was of noble birth, that he did have connections, direct relations with the Earls of Huntingdon and the Lords of Locksley. This I've shown. I've also shown that the type of man he was, which fits with the legend. Now, historically, I was faced with a situation some years back when, through my square dancing, the Americans wanted to know more about Robin Hood. Because I was a successful square dance caller, they thought I equally might know a lot about Robin Hood. They asked questions. Rather than lie to them, I decided to start on this research, which was just a little look at the story of Robin Hood. But I've enjoyed it so much that I just had to keep on and on and on, basically so I could offer the truth to the tourist, and of course I could offer the truth to Nottingham, the city of Nottingham, who Robin Hood really was.
No, but there is nevertheless a very distinct gulf between the Robin Hood of fact and the Robin Hood of fiction, the Robin Hood of the myth. How has the myths, the stories, grown up about him?
Well, I think this is the way that people interpret things. In the first 200 years before the printed story of Robin Hood, the stories were sung, my ballads, and the stories were told. Now, what are they? If I got 20 or 30 people in this room and I stood up and did a 20-verse poem of 4-line stanzas, and then you all went away with excellent memories, and you wrote down what I told you, or you passed it on by word of mouth, it would change. And this is what's happened. The thing has changed. Not only has it changed, but people have put, not willful changes in it, but they've put changes to suit themselves. So up in the New England part of America, instead of reading an eke in jail he lay, regarding Will Stuteley, we find the chap there is an Eacon jail he lay, which makes it really topical. Eacon being a place up there in New England, in America. So people would gradually change the thing, and how much of the legend is addition, how much of it is truth, I don't know. They're interrelated. Some would take from the stories, the true stories, which are lost, and some of the, what we consider true stories, will be taken from the imaginations and the makeup of other people. So it's an awful job to decide the truth in the legend, as from, I won't say untruth, but from imagination.
Absolutely, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
I definitely think Robin Hood did exist. I think he was a nobleman with socialistic ideas, which was unforgivable in those days.
It appeals to you, obviously, as a socialist alderman.
Yes, and he took to the forest. He didn't rob the rich to give it to the poor. He simply took back from the rich what they'd already taken from the poor.
Do you think, perhaps on a more serious sort of topical note, that the fact that now it's widely known that the Robin Hood of fact wasn't quite the Robin Hood of fiction will have any impact, say, on Nottingham as a tourist centre?
I'm hoping it creates more interest. And this has been my object for years now, is to make more interest in Nottingham in Robin Hood. I think it's good for the city and it's good for everything too, because Robin Hood, to read about Robin Hood is easy. They're good, exciting tales, and it's something because we don't get a lot of them nowadays.
Well, certainly as far as you're concerned, in the Robin Hood mythology, there'll always be a maid marrying a Little John and a Friar Tuck.
Oh yes, yes, definitely. Well, I think it makes better reading with them. And although Jim, he likes to get into the logical facts, I mean, I like a bit of romance in these things.
Do you feel a sort of sense of shame about the part that your predecessor, the rather wicked sheriff, played in all this?
I don't think there's anything to be ashamed of. I don't think probably the sheriff and Robin Hood were enemies. It's quite possible they weren't, because they're probably both of noble birth and probably know each other pretty well.
Mr. Sheriff, thank you very much.
Yeah.
But now that it's known that the Robin Hood of fact wasn't quite the Robin Hood of fiction... But now that it's known that the Robin Hood of fact wasn't quite the Robin Hood of fiction, do you think it'll have any impact, for instance, on Nottingham's attraction as a tourist centre? But certainly as far as you're concerned, in the Robin Hood mythology, there'll always be a Maid Marian, a Friar Tuck and a Little John. Do you feel any sense of shame, then, about the part which your predecessor, the wicked Sheriff of Nottingham, played in the Robin Hood story? Do you think, though, that the fact that... Sorry. Now that it's known that the Robin Hood of fact isn't quite the Robin Hood of fiction...
Sorry.
Yeah. All right?
Is it gone? Yeah.
Now that it's known that the Robin Hood of fact wasn't quite the Robin Hood of fiction, do you think that it'll have any impact, for instance, on Nottingham's attraction as a tourist centre? But for you, then, of course, there will always be a place for Maid Marian, Little John and Friar Tuck in the Robin Hood mythology.
Reverse's first interview.
But did he, in fact, hold up people in Sherwood Forest... Sorry, starting again.
Rewind it.
But did he, in fact, hold up rich people in Sherwood Forest, as the legend says, take their money off them and then redistribute it to the poor?
Do you want a cup?
Mm-hmm. But how did he do it? Did he sort of hold them up in the forest at bow and arrow point? But I gather, in fact, he was a particularly religious man. But according to the legend, of course, he lived a life of sort of idyllic passion with Maid Marian under the glades of Sherwood Forest. Now, does history bear this one out?
As far as written, because a hand as an archer, yeah.
One of the other points about Robin Hood, of course, was that he was supposed to be an absolute dab hand as an archer with a bow and arrow. Now, was this true? Now, what about this personal feud, which is supposed to have existed between the... Sorry again. What about this personal feud, which is supposed to have existed between Robin Hood and the Sheriff of Nottingham? Is there historical evidence to support this? Now all this, of course, explodes one of the rather basic myths of... Sorry, starting again. Now this new evidence about Robin Hood explains one of the rather basic myths of English folklore. What did your research consist of? How did you come to these conclusions? But there is nevertheless a fairly distinct gap between the Robin Hood of fact and the Robin Hood of fiction. Sorry, starting again. Teeth are slipping. But there is obviously a fairly distinct gap between the Robin Hood of fact and the Robin Hood of fiction. How have these stories about Robin Hood built up over the years? These shots of Mr. Lees are the final shots in the mute sequence to precede the first interview.
Just be reading it through.
Program item intro. If you like your myths inviolate, free... Sorry, starting again. If you like your myths inviolate, free from the unsympathetic probings of clinical historians, then this story isn't for you, because it concerns the debunking of this fellow, the hero of Sherwood Forest, Robin Hood. And appropriately, perhaps, we found the evidence for this debunking in the office of Robin's arch-enemy, the Sheriff of Nottingham. But first, let's just refresh our minds about the Robin Hood story. Wind up.